So we are going to move on to academic honesty. So what Helen started to preface when she was doing grading, and academic honesty tend to tie very closely together, as well as dealing with failure. As we saw, students will need to try and try again, and sometimes that can be a stressor for them. Cause them to think about, I just need to get this done, or what are the different pieces that they need to do, and just how can I get that done through the path of least resistance. So we're going to talk a little bit about academic honesty, particularly why academic honesty is important, and we're going to talk about a few scenarios that may come up in the classroom. But why we want to talk about this is you probably know what cheating looks like in math or in English. But when it comes to computer science, it is a very collaborative field. But there's a line that you need to walk in your classes that is between collaborating and cheating. So that's what we're really trying to get to is, this is something that you may experience in your class, and how do you best deal with this? So the way that we are going to talk about it is through this game. We call this game Cheat or No Cheat. And that is because we are going to share a few different scenarios, and you are going to determine whether that is cheating by putting up a fist, because apparently this is bringing down the hammer on cheating cases. Or if you think all is good, you're going to do an open palm, which is essentially a high five. So high five, all is good. And this is one of these activities where you are not allowed to opt out. So I will wait for everyone to put up their hand. I will wait as long as I need to. Not yet, but thank you. Thank you for getting there to participation. But this is something that you will want to discuss as a teaching team, and we'll talk about some best practices at the end of this. But we're going to start off just by going through a few different scenarios and getting a sense of what you think is cheating and what you think isn't cheating. All right. So we are going to start with the first scenario. And so I don't talk that much. I'm going to come over here. And James, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing all right. And I was wondering if you might be my reader for this first scenario.
Sure.
Thank you.
Simon doesn't understand how to animate a sprite walking. He asks Karima for help. Karima sits down in Simon's chair and starts to explain how to change the sprite's costume and exposition in a loop, building the loop on Simon's computer as she talks. After Karima gets up, Simon thanks her and then changes some of the loop's values.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. So we are going to take about 5-10 seconds to think about this. Think about it by yourself. And then when I say go, which is not, don't use that one. When I say go, we're going to put up either a fist if you think this is cheating, or an open palm, high five if you think this is not cheating. So think about it. 5 or so seconds. All right. Ready, set, go. So I see some halves, I see some, all right, so I see some open palms, I see some fists. It looks like we're pretty mixed, so let's hear from both sides. So we're going to start on this side of the room and then make our way just kind of back and forth. So can I get a volunteer that said this was a cheating scenario? All right.
Hi, Dan Church from Mariner High School. The one of the faux pas here is the Karima actually sat down and typed in the material rather than Simon.
Right. So in this case, it looks like she was writing down that material and then he kind of built off of that. That was a great point. What about someone who said that was not cheating? I don't remember which one I said.
Well, I teach a class where they do this, and sometimes they switch seats and they team write their program. And so sometimes students can learn a lot by just observing. It doesn't say that they're doing that here. So if I had a choice, I would probably choose something between cheating and not cheating without the context. But, I think if it were a test, probably cheating.
Right. So context is very, very important in a lot of these scenarios. That's sometimes where we get the biggest feedback in terms of this segment is you haven't given us enough context. And that is true. It's difficult to give you, this is everything that has happened. These are the trends. But yes, depending on the scenario, this could be seen as cheating. If this was an exam and Karima, sat in Simon's chair and encoded, in that sense, both of them are cheating. If this is maybe pair programming where one person is the driver, the other is the kind of navigator, that case may be different. One good rule of thumb that we like to share with our teams as you're thinking about these policies is that sometimes it's good to have a policy if students are working, individually, that another student is not allowed to touch that student's keyboard. So if you are in lab and you're doing individual work, you are typing on your own keyboard. In this case, if that policy wasn't stated and this was kind of an individual lab time, this may be seen as cheating. Other ways that Karima could have, still supported or worked with Simon is, maybe going to the whiteboard, maybe drawing out, the situation and discussing it in that avenue, not just sitting in his chair and typing for it. So let's go on to the next one. We're going to go to the center column. So can I get a reader from this one?
Maya is stumped on how to read in each fraction separately in her FracCalc program. She is staring at her code trying to think of something to try. Antoine sees her difficulties and says, "Use a scanner." Maya asks, "What's that?" Antoine guides Maya to the class website and the slides that explain how scanner works.
Awesome, thank you. So again, we're going to take a few seconds, and as context, FracCalc, if you do not know, that is a project that we do in the AP Computer Science A class. So it's a project that is a fraction calculator, reads in some fractions, does some math, and spits out a result. So take about 5 more seconds to think about this one before we decide if it's a cheat or no cheat. All right, ready, set, go. All right, so it looks like we have some pretty good consensus here. So a lot of people are, raising a open hand, open palm, and we would agree there. In this case, depending on what the objective, of this lesson is, and in this case, it likely isn't figure out where the scanner class is. Some of these pieces that are on your website that are resources for everyone, that's not something that should be hidden, that should be difficult to find. So in this case, we would also agree, as you have all seen, that this isn't a cheating scenario. Awesome. All right, gonna make my way this way. We're gonna go to this column, get some responses here. We're gonna first start with the reader. Who would like to read? Maybe someone in one of these rows, since I'm so close to you. Thank you. What is your name? Brian, I should know that, sorry.
The sprite in Steven's platform game isn't falling correctly after it jumps. He asks Nora for help. Nora opens up a previously submitted lab assignment that involved combining conditionals and loops and reminds Steven how it worked in that assignment. Steven opens up his version of that old assignment and copies some blocks into his platform game.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. So again, we'll take about 5 seconds, 5-10 seconds, think about what's happening here. And then ready, set, go. All right, so I see mostly open palms. I see a few folks that think this might be cheating. So let's hear first from those who think it's cheating. Bringing down the hammer. Why do you think this scenario is cheating? One would like to share some. Let me go to you, Keisha, bringing you a mic. There we go.
So the first thing I noticed is that he specifically copied from her old assignment, which I don't think is allowed and counts as cheating.
Oh, he copied from his old assignment.
Oh, in the cabinets I go to university, that still counts as cheating if it was your own.
Even if it's your own? So that's interesting. If you have the policy where, looking back on your code is not allowed, that case could be cheating depending on that policy. It's a great point. What about, I think the majority thought that this, wasn't necessarily a cheating scenario. What perspective might that be? So let's see, let's see if there are any new folks that want to share any thoughts. Great, we're gonna go to the back end. Grace has a mic.
I was just thinking that as a teacher, you want students to engage and connect to old material and bring it to new material. And so it could be that I wanted Stephen to make that connection and to look back at his old work to extend future work. And so Nora just pointed him in the right direction. She didn't necessarily tell him how to do it.
Right. So depending, again, it is dependent on the policy, depending on the context. But in this scenario, if you don't have a policy of using previous work is not allowed, we would also consider this, not cheating. There's a case that you want to think about if, Stephen does not have the right previous assignment. Is that the best thing for him to be using? So that's not directly aligned with cheating, but something that you will want to think about in some of these scenarios. But it is great if students can really build off of those concepts, off of those assignments that they've already seen. Helps reinforce the concepts and helps see how everything comes together. Awesome. So I'm going to read this one, which is Evangeline was out sick when the class covered some tips for how to store fractions in FracCalc. Out of the corner of her eye, she sees Brian starting to write his program. So she turns her head to watch his screen and see which variables he's creating. So we're going to think about it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. So I see mostly cheating, some open palms. All right, let's hear from those who don't think it's cheating. Let's hear from them first. We'll open up to the group. Grace will cover this side. I'll cover this side. So anyone want to share why they think this is not an example of cheating? Let's go back here. Okay, Dominic.
All right. Well, first, I definitely think it's frowned upon. So just because I don't think it's cheating doesn't mean I don't think it's right. I think that if you're seeing somebody create a couple of variables getting started and it's for a couple seconds, it's not great, but it's not something I would say, immediately bring down repercussions specifically involving that, especially because you don't know the context in which those things are being used. So it might be more of a activation to get started on what you would do with something like that rather than a specific copying and pasting on what's going on.
So that's definitely a good point of, there are some things that are, or in this case, it is not black or white. As we know, this is a spectrum of kind of gray area that we are looking at. So I think it's definitely a good point to think about, as you're thinking about some of these cases, it's not necessarily that you're assigning like the same repercussion to every single one of these. There may be different levels of kind of how you want to approach these policies. And that's a great point. What about those who, well, I think we can figure out why you may think it's cheating. Kind of looking at someone's screen, again, as Dominic mentioned, that's definitely something you should not be doing, especially when that may be looking at what they're creating on that code. But how you deal with that is, again, it's going to be a spectrum of, something you should discuss in terms of if that is cheating, how do you treat that versus copying an entire assignment? I think in this case, just generally, we would say, this is probably cheating. It may not mean like, oh, you get a 0 on this assignment or, you need something that severe. But looking at a person's code, looking at what they're creating is definitely a no-no.
Can I jump in, Rachel?
Yeah, go ahead,
I would
Grace.
also add from a teacher's perspective that if I saw a student doing this, I would take this as a failing of my own. That student wasn't there for that lesson and I didn't catch that student up, and that student doesn't feel like they can come to me and say, I don't know what I'm doing, right? So I would ask myself the question, why does that student feel like their only option was to look onto someone else's screen when they were confused? So I would just toss that in.
Thank you for sharing, Grace. Awesome. So we are going to go on to our last scenario. I'm going to have Adam, if you wouldn't mind. I'd love it if you could read the scenario for us. Thank you.
Sarah and Christine both have Pong working, but the gameplay is boring because the ball bounces in very predictable ways. They sit together at one workstation and experiment with different algorithms for making the movement more interesting. They come up with a really neat way to vary things. Both students use this algorithm in their submission.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. All right. So again, we're going to take about 5 seconds And there's some chatter, and we will talk a little bit more in detail about this one. Yes. We don't have that context yet, but we will talk about that. So let's just, given the context, what is your gut response? What is your gut response to whether this is cheating or not? Ready, set, go. All right. So we see, there are definitely some open palms. There are definitely some fists. So this is an interesting case. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Imani brought up a very interesting point of, she asked, is there a collaboration forum for this? What is the context of this situation? So I want you to take, a minute or two to discuss with your neighbors. Discuss this situation. What are you missing from this situation? And discuss both sides. Is this considered cheating, or is it not considered cheating? So we'll take about 2 minutes to do this, and then regroup and discuss some of your thoughts. All right. So I would love to hear some of your thoughts on this situation, because I think everyone had a sense that this is definitely, unlike a lot of the other scenarios, a very gray area in terms of collaboration, and what how you walk that line between collaboration and cheating. So let's get a few thoughts. Let me go to, I don't know your name, I'm sorry. What is your name? Anita. So let me bring it over here first.
So primarily, the assignment should, but teachers should say in advance if collaboration is allowed or not, and also define the guidelines of collaboration. So in one of my courses in OGI in computer science, so we said we could collaboratively discuss the problem with each other, but we're supposed to come out with our own solution at the end. So that is one way you could do it. And another way is probably you could say you both can collaborate, and finally in the assignment mention who did what. Say like one person may be good in design and one person may be good in the coding, and so they kind of say, I did 50% of the coding, 20% of the implementation, 30% of the testing, or something like that.
Awesome. Yeah, I think there are a lot of great points there. That I just want to reiterate really quickly is, as I think many of you got, having a collaboration policy is very important, and what that looks like in your classroom. Having some examples, bringing up these scenarios or other scenarios you think you might see are important, and something you can even do with your students. And I think the other point that Anita brought up that was interesting is kind of trying to write out or reflect on their contributions to their assignment. So say you have this collaboration policy in place, having if they are able to work with others, pointing out this is the part that I felt very strong in, this is a part where I really worked closely with X, or even if they're looking at outside resources. This idea of citing your sources that is brought up in English, it can work well in computer science as well, especially with some of these assignments. Awesome. Logan, did you have a quick thought as well?
Yeah, I just want to add that they're not, according to this, they're not sharing code. They're only sharing algorithms, an algorithm. So, and there are different ways to implement the same algorithm. So as long as they're not sharing code, I don't see anything wrong with it unless there's an explicit, something explicitly stated in the assignment that you cannot collaborate.
Right, so I think that's a great point of, sharing ideas versus sharing code versus, what is the spectrum of how you collaborated? Was that on a whiteboard? Was that on, next to each other? You were looking at your respective computers, but still coding kind of next to each other. Those are all pieces that, there's a lot to think about in cheating, or in academic honesty. But that is, a good point of what might be the different ways that students can collaborate. And thinking about what of those are going to be acceptable, are going to be conducive to creating a strong environment, and what can be more harmful. Awesome. Imani, did you have a thought? Or okay, just quickly, we'll do one more thought.
I think it's just something similar to what everyone was saying, but like when I was in high school, they would say, "Oh yeah, you can't collaborate or you can't cheat." But oftentimes, like if it's something that you just really can't figure out, or maybe you're going outside the box, like maybe the algorithms that they're trying to implement wasn't something that was listed in the rubric that they were given, and they just want to go outside the box. Oftentimes, like teachers will work with those students, and if you collaborate it, you just submit a paper saying, "Hey, we collaborate together." You sign it, you turn it in, and oftentimes teachers are okay with that. So yeah, I don't really see it as cheating at all.
Yeah, and this one is definitely, this is kind of one that we say, it depends, which is not a fun answer. But in this case, because we don't have that full context, it does depend. And these are a lot of decisions that you'll want to be making as a teaching team, but particularly with your classroom teacher. They really know the policies of their school, so they'll be able to direct you as volunteers kind of what the policies are and where these different scenarios fall. I think the last point to bring up with one of these situations is if you're not quite sure of collaboration, kind of if there's a fine line of, well, this code looks very similar, as Helen kind of alluded to, and what I've seen in Berkeley as a TA is doing some face-to-face grading, which we talked about before. So really having the students meeting with them, asking them questions, learning about what did they learn, how did they write this code, or can you explain this algorithm to me in your own words, not just reading line by line of code. That's another piece that in this collaborative space you can think about using as you're thinking about, was that academically honest or not? So that is it in terms of our scenarios. So just a few best practices that we have. The first, as I think all of us are aware of, is creating a clear policy. Again, that's based on school requirements. So if a school specifies that something is cheating, that is what goes. That is the school's policy. You have to abide by the school's policy. You should review that policy, during the first few weeks of class, even send it home with the students to bring to their parents so everyone is aware of what this policy is, and when situations like this may come up, you have that policy to fall back on and ensure that all stakeholders in the student's grade, in their what have you, they are aware that this is a policy that was set at the beginning. And then the last point is posting it, making sure that it's available so a student can't go up to you and say, well, I didn't know that this was a policy. You should hopefully know if you saw it in the syllabus and it's on the website or what have you. I mentioned face-to-face grading of projects. So again, really digging into what they've learned, and that will also be a good point of reflection for those students, which is the next point as well. And then you will want to investigate some unexpected differences. As Kit mentioned, there are dispositional and situational factors that come into play. If you see a student that they may have been struggling with a concept, but then they suddenly really get that next concept, that is great if that just comes very naturally. But you may want to check with them, just say like, how can you explain this concept to me? Or like, if they really get it, they can explain it to other students as well. So we don't, again, want to give any students kind of these dispositional, this is what I think, why you failed or why you passed. You want to really dig into that and kind of investigate to make sure that the students are really learning the material that they should be learning. And then lastly, if you do find cases where cheating may have occurred, you want to follow through on that policy. And most often, almost all the time, and probably in all of your classes, you should have the classroom teacher. The classroom teacher should be the person who's really following through on these policies. May that be involving parents or administrators. That is not something we are asking or telling our volunteers to do. So if you do see these cases, because you may be doing some of these grading projects or assignments, make sure that you're talking with your teacher, even if they aren't physically grading all the assignments with you, so that they are aware of the circumstances or the scenarios, and that you can proceed with the proper steps. So that is it for, do you have a quick question or comment? Let me bring you, we can offer a quick tip. If you've been in the class, that's always great to hear. There we go.
Yeah, so I was just going to offer that one of the places where I've observed some inappropriate code sharing going on has been where there was the same project at the school year after year, and there were some students that were desperate enough, or different circumstances. But anyway, the temptation was there to talk to one of the upperclassmen that had done the class before. So anyway, one idea to reduce that might be to change your curriculum so that you're doing an alternative project mixed in from year to year. Anyway.
I think that's definitely a good point. If you have the capacity to think about modifications to the assignments, I know we have our curriculum for all of these classes. There is a set curriculum. There are lesson plans. There are materials. But if you're able to discuss with your team, if you had this class multiple years and want to discuss maybe what are some modifications that will still point at these concepts, but it won't be a carbon copy of the previous year. I think that's a great point to be thinking about if you've really grown that program and have that long history of students.